At some point, every manager will have to do what is arguably the worst part of a manager's job. You will have to fire someone. And for all the time that we spend working to hire the right folks and support them to succeed, we rarely talk about how to know when it's time to say goodbye and how to do it respectfully. And that is why I am so excited for today's guest, Jackie Koch. Jackie has more than 15 years of experience hiring teams and leading human resources for Fortune 500 companies, startups, and small businesses. She launched People Principles in 2020, where she helped founders scale and lead their teams with HR and recruiting services. She's also the host of the World's Greatest Boss podcast. Now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and other tips for managers every week. Now, here's my conversation with Jackie. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jackie. We're going to talk about a topic, firing, which I've never talked about on the show, and is something that just is, I will say for myself, one of the worst parts of being a manager. Even worse than having to give feedback is having to fire someone. And I don't think that there's been a manager ever that hasn't had to go through this. So I'm really excited to finally being able to cover this on the show and to learn from you today. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I agree. I think it's an inevitable thing that you're going to have to do when you are a manager. And it never gets easy, but it gets easier, I guess. Like, I hope that I never get to the point where like firing somebody is like, oh, this is so easy, but it does get easier with practice and with some, just keeping some things in mind. So I'm really excited to dig into this.
Let's begin with when you should fire someone. Like, when do you know you're at that point where this is the right decision? And I say this because I've worked with clients who are like, oh, I have this person and it's not working. I think I just need to fire them. And there's usually things you're supposed to do before, things that we can do before. But getting to that point of making the decision, of knowing and having confidence that the right decision is to fire someone, doesn't always feel so easy. So maybe you can start with just how do we get ourselves to that place where we know that this is the right decision?
There's two kind of situations you might find yourself in. The first would be somebody does like a major policy violation, like some sort of sexual harassment, some sort of just major infraction that either puts somebody else in harm's way or is just like really major. And I think when that happens, it's okay to fire them like almost immediately, maybe not like right in that moment, but taking a step back, maybe like putting them on a leave and then firing them is one reason. But they're not very common at all. Like, as you alluded to, most of the time it's just like this like death of a thousand cuts, right? Of like, I feel like I need to get rid of this person, but I don't know. And I think the right time is when you can confidently say that they know they're not doing a good job. They know what needs to improve and they haven't been doing it. That is when you know. That often like puts the onus back on you as the manager, right? To make sure you're doing those things. But that is the moment when you really know, is when you can clearly say that they were told they're not performing, they know what they need to do, and they still are not improving.
I love that the criteria is actually about them not either being capable of or choosing to step up in the ways that they needed to. That's when you say, I've done what my job is. I've been clear with them about what needs to change. I've been supportive of them to make the change, and the change still hasn't happened. And that's the cutoff, which feels so much better than what I think sometimes happens around, I don't really know what else to do. I don't really know. I haven't really given them the feedback. I kind of mentioned it, maybe sort of, be like, and it gets all crazy. But so clear. It's just like, you got to talk to people. You have to give them feedback before you fire someone. You have to give them the opportunity to grow and the support that they need to get there before you fire someone. Already, I feel like a deep breath is like so calming
Done.
now.
And we're in and over.
Okay. So we've gotten to that point. We know that this is the right thing to do. And I know this is different in different states. There's different rules and regulations, but for the things that are kind of in common, or the steps that we should be taking to get us from the place of, all right, I've made this decision, to the conversation. So not even what we should do in the conversation, but to the place of, we're going to go have that I'm firing you conversation.
It might be helpful to take a step even before you walk into that conversation. Because when you lay the groundwork well, you're less nervous walking into the conversation. And so I think it's important to really talk about what does it look like to be clear with someone that they're not meeting the expectations? Because what I have found is that managers talk around the situation and they think they were clear, but they weren't. And so the worst thing, and it's happened many times where, I lead HR and I've been in-house before, we need to fire someone. I'm in on the conversation and it is clear that it is a surprise to this person. Those are the worst situations to be in because you can tell it is an actual surprise. When you are having performance problems with an employee, it is really important that you sit down and clearly map out the concerns that you have. Share, hey, this is what I've noticed. This isn't getting done. Clearly list off a handful of objective things that you're noticing on why performance isn't good and ask them, what's going on? What do you need in order for these things to happen? And sometimes you might find that it's something you're maybe withholding, not intentionally, but something you're not doing. Maybe it's a training. Maybe it's they don't have the skills that they thought they had, but there's a way that they could get it. And it's just having a really curious conversation with the person of this is what I need. It's not happening. Why do you think that is? Because a lot of times when an employee comes to their own conclusion, they are more bought into it. Sometimes they might not know and you'll have to share why you think it is. But I think that first conversation is clear. And then the most important thing you can do is follow up with that in writing. Because a lot of times what happens is you're in the conversation, you think you're clear, you think the employee gets it, but they don't. And so one of the best things you can do is follow up after your in-person conversation or video convo and say, hey, Joe, thanks for having that conversation with us today. Just to make sure we're both on the same page, I wanted to recap. This is what we discussed. This is what you're going to do. This is what you need from me and what I'm going to do. Let's revisit this again in 30 days to see how it's going. And then put a calendar invite on the books to revisit it. And when you put it in writing in that way, it's not necessarily a performance improvement plan, but it's making it kind of real. When they get it in an email and they read it, it's oh, they were serious, and you can feel confident that you delivered the message in two ways, right? Because I'm sure you know this, you have to be a broken record when you're a manager. People have to hear the same thing, 6 or 7 times before they fully get it. And so just having a conversation with that, you might not be a clear communicator, so they may not get it. But then if you follow up in writing, that's huge. And then you follow up in the time that you say you're going to, and you have the conversation again. And you do that 2 or 3 times. And after the 3rd time, if there's no meaningful progress being made, that's when you know it's time to fire someone. I'll stop there in case anything's come up, but I think sometimes people forget that whole part because if you've done all of that, the 3rd conversation is actually not as scary because you've already had the conversation 3 other times,
Yes. Well, first, thank you so much for laying out what it looks like in really practical terms for how to get to that decision point. Where I was just oh, great, we're at the decision point, done. But actually, there's a process that gets you there. And I want to point out 2 things that you said. The first was that putting it in writing, which is so important as to get that message across many times and also gives the other person an opportunity to say, wait a second, I'm confused. This isn't what I understood. And you clear up that confusion earlier. And if there was any concerns that this person didn't get the message, it's now been tracked that yes, they definitely got the message. So that's so important to follow up in the writing. The second thing is when it comes to performance, it's a little bit easier to say, well, this is what I need and this is what's not happening, or this is what success looks like and this is, where there are gaps. I've talked with folks who've struggled where it's maybe not totally a performance issue, but it's related to performance in that there's something about the way the person shows up, something in their personality, something in their style that causes kind of frictions or a lack of cohesion on the team that kind of slows people down or kind of just ultimately seems like it's not a good dynamic. And it's not that what they're doing is wrong. It's not bad. It's just stylistically, these people we're not gelling as a team in a way that's actually good for the organization. And it's clear that there's one person who's kind of the source of the friction. Any thoughts on how we track that kind of improvement needed?
So I think it's so critical to have a regular standing one-on-one with each person that is reporting to you. Doesn't have to be weekly, but it should at least be like at least monthly. And the reason why is because it gives you a time in which you can bring up some of these things that don't seem like a super big deal, but need to be discussed. Because if you don't have a moment in which you know you're going to be having a conversation with someone, the stuff just kind of boils up. And then you're like, man, now I just got to like put this time on a calendar out of nowhere. And it feels more serious than it actually is. But it just like there was no moment for you to like deliver that feedback. And so if you are having a regular check-in, and you can even do this in the moment, right? Like Kim Scott's Radical Candor really teaches us a lot about that. But it's like when you notice that dynamic off, addressing it, So like an example could be they're just not like resourceful or like looking up their own information. They're just expecting other people to like have the answers without doing work. Like you can address that and just say, hey, I've noticed that when you get stuck on something, instead of taking 10 minutes to like look through the Notion page or look through wherever stuff is, you just immediately reach out to the team. And did you know that interrupts their day, interrupts their workflow, and like kind of like talk about the impacts of what that action does and say, you doing a little bit of work to figure it out on your own teaches you where things are. It helps you be more autonomous, and it like doesn't totally interrupt somebody's day. And you can also say like, I'm not saying don't ask questions or try to like, don't try to get help when you need it, but taking that step can really help you, and that's one example. But it's like that feedback can be given, but it doesn't feel like it's important enough a lot of times to managers to do that. But the more you let that stuff go, the more it's going to happen. And then it becomes this like weird, what do I do with this? So the more comfortable you get addressing that stuff right away, the better it's going to be. So that's like one example. I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones, or like, hey, I noticed how you showed up to the meeting. You were, not on camera. All of us are. The reason why we're on camera is just so that like the team can read body language, and it really helps with building a team. Like, I'm curious, like why have you been not showing up on camera? Like, it seems like you might be a little disengaged, or, it's hard for the team to relate to you. It's like, you can have those conversations. And I think sometimes managers just shy away from it, either because they're busy, they think they'll do it later, or they just feel uncomfortable or like they can't.
All right, I want to move us forward into the next phase. Okay, so we've had these conversations, we've tracked, we've sent the email follow-ups, we've done it 3 times, we decided this person is not the right person for this role any longer. What do we do next?
Well, you have to have the conversation. And it depends on the size of your business, on if it's just you having the conversation, if you get somebody else in on the conversation. I think the manager should always be the one leading the conversation. Even if you do bring in an HR or like a director or something like that, like you as the manager have the best relationship with that person, that hearing this from you is like an important part of your job. And I think sometimes people want to punt it to an HR person or somebody else. And I just think you're doing yourself a discredit and that person. So I want to say that. A couple things to keep in mind is sometimes some businesses really want to get like a signed release of claims for various reasons in the form of like a severance agreement. Sometimes you need that, sometimes you don't. It just depends really how your leadership team thinks about that stuff. I think, as it relates to like firing somebody for performance and they were given us like very clear instructions, I don't think a severance is necessary. But I bring that up only because I know I've worked with clients who are like, we need a signed a release form whenever we fire anybody. And in order to get that, you typically have to give something in exchange for a signature. So I think I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if you want to dig into that at all, but just want to mention that because I know some managers listening might work somewhere that like, that's really important.
Yeah, well, it sounds like if you're working inside an organization where you are not the senior leader, then you should definitely be talking to HR to understand what the typical policies are, what their practices are, under what circumstances different things apply. And if you are the senior most person in your organization, you can think about, do you want to do those things, right? Do you want to have someone sign something? Do you want to give them severance? Do you want anything else? Do you want to reach out and get some help from a HR consultant to make sure that you're not leaving yourself or your organization open for any kind of issues in the future?
Yeah,
So at the very
exactly.
least, thank you for mentioning that.
Yes. So let's say everything you have all of that, you're not going to be doing that. You've had that conversation, you've decided you're not going to be doing that. I think, you just have to set up a time to meet with them. I've heard experts say, never fire someone on a Friday or never fire someone on a Monday. But the reality is like, there's no perfect day to fire somebody. Like there just isn't. And I think what can be the most beneficial is it's like doing it as soon as you know you need to, right? Like putting it off and putting it off, I think just creates more anxiety for you. So it's like doing it as soon as you know you need to. And sometimes that looks like, hey, I have a standing one-on-one with this person on Tuesday mornings. That's when I'm going to have the conversation. Sometimes it's, hey, I need to chat with you, right now. It kind of like on the spot. Like I wish I could say do it exactly this way, but it's kind of like it depends on what's on the schedule, what's on the calendars. Like I definitely don't think doing it right after like they deliver a big meeting for a client, like looking at what that person has on their workload for that week and just like, when would I want this to happen? Like it's kind of almost like the golden rule. Like, okay, when would I feel the most respected? I don't know. Like when would it make sense? So kind of looking at their calendar and then deciding when to have the meeting. And then in actually having the conversation, like don't hide the lead. Like just go straight into it of, hey, we've been talking for the last 60 days about your performance. We've had multiple conversations about it. What's expected. And we've both seen that it's, over the last 60 days, it's not improving. And I think unfortunately at this point, this role is just not the right fit for you. And so today's going to be your last day. I always recommend it being like that same day, if possible, and just like delivering it right out of the bat. Like don't wait to the end of a 30-minute meeting to like say it, right off bat. Give them a beat to like digest it. Allow them to have questions or ask feedback. Most of the times they don't, sometimes they do. Sometimes it can get into an argument of like them explaining why things haven't happened or, all of that. And it's okay to have a conversation back and forth a bit, but if it does get to the point where they feel like they can fight enough to keep their job, you can say, look, this isn't up for negotiation. Like we've had these conversations. Unfortunately, the decision's been made. And then kind of go into, what happens with their final paycheck, what happens with their equipment, all of that kind of stuff. I've gotten a lot of questions about like, well, what do I do? Do I cut off their like email access right away? It's like questions about some of those logistical things. And those are so dependent on your business as well as the person's role. Like, do they have access to email a bunch of clients? Like, could they do damage in a short amount of time? Like, you have to mitigate that risk. I think more often than not, that people don't do that, especially if you've been having those candid conversations leading up to it. They're not surprised. So it's like more often than not, like people that you've hired can act like adults and will be respectful as well. And so I think it can really feel damaging to somebody if all of a sudden they have no email, you're walking them out of the office. It just feels like very robotic. Like you want to like balance that relationship that they have with you and their teams versus like the risk mitigation of what damage they could actually do. And that's just so dependent on the business and their role, to be honest.
Preparing for the meeting, love the idea that we don't want to hide the lead. I was actually watching Moneyball on an airplane recently, and Brad Pitt's character basically says the same thing about trading baseball players, where he's teaching the younger guy, like, how do you tell a player they need to be traded or they've been traded? He's like, you just go in and you just say, so-and-so, you've been traded to the such and such team. And that, like, just do not sugarcoat, we're so sad to see you leave, just say it so that it's clear and respectful. And the other piece I want to pull up here too that you talked about is we need to be prepared with what those next steps are.
Oh, yeah.
So that we can tell them this is what's going to happen now. And here's what's going to happen with your email. Here's what you do with your computer, especially if we're not co-located. And there's probably a lot of open questions about, how does this all play out now? Because you're not going to walk me out of the office. I'm not going to clear out my desk because I'm working from home. So how does all of that work? So we need to have a plan for that and be ready to communicate it. And then lastly, the piece around don't argue. And this is always such an interesting one because sometimes I feel like people want to know, like, was there something I could have done differently? Like, why did this happen to me? I'm guessing that you just repeat the same thing you've been repeating, which is, well, we talked about this. These were the expectations that we had. And, you were not able to meet them over the past X number of months that we've been working on this. And so that's it. Is that right? Like we can have that conversation and just reiterate what we've been saying.
I think sometimes people go into any feedback or termination conversation, like forgetting that you're dealing with a human relationship that you've built. So it's like, if you've done the work of being a good manager and you have a real relationship with this person, like you can have that conversation again and you can say, remember, we've talked about all of this. And yes, just reiterate everything that you've said 100%. The other thing I would mention, this is a little bit of a shift from your last question, but remember that this conversation isn't about you as the manager. Like you feel so uncomfortable. It's really awkward for you. It doesn't really matter to that person how uncomfortable you feel, how bad you feel. Like they don't really care. And I know that might sound a little like harsh, but I do think sometimes we forget that it's like about them. And so however you can like put yourself in their shoes, that's just like a good mindset shift to get yourself into before you go into the meeting.
That is so important because I think sometimes we say things or do things that are about making ourselves feel better in the moment, but actually are less respectful to the other person, right? Like when we say like, I'm so sorry this is happening, right? Like, I'm so sorry that I'm taking away your livelihood. I'd feel terrible about this. But when you say that to someone, you're right. It doesn't make them feel any better because you were the decision maker. And so it doesn't like it's not helping them. It's really not. And so remembering that and making sure that we go in with that sense of calm and respect for the other person and really trying to leave them feeling like this was conveyed in the most kind of dignified way, I think is so, so, so important. So is there anything else that we either absolutely should or absolutely shouldn't do or kind of any other big mindsets, tips, etc., just to make sure that we're not going to set ourselves up for a terrible experience or set our colleague up for a terrible experience?
There's definitely like some legality things not to do, which I think I'm not going to totally dive into in this conversation because I think it's important as you are going to fire somebody that you have spoken to like an HR person or just somebody to like understand some of those legality things. So I do definitely want to like mention that there are things like certain legal things, like when you have to give a final paycheck, what you can and cannot say, but like talk to an attorney or an HR professional about that. But from like a leadership, like manager perspective, what I see happen a lot is like you're nervous. So you write down exactly what you're going to say. And then somebody asks a question and you look back down to what you wrote and you see that you don't have an answer to that question. So then you just like robotically repeat the same line you've already said because you're nervous. For an example, someone might ask a question about why, and you're like, you just repeat the same answer. I'm trying to think of an example, but it's like robotic. It's like, I'm sorry, but today is going to be your last day. There's nothing we can do. And you're like, okay, but I know that you asked that. My point here is like, you can still have like a relationship conversation with that person. So like if somebody asks like, can you tell me a little bit more why? You can still be a real human. You don't have to just like, I think some managers are trained, stick to the facts, say nothing else, be a robot, don't get yourself in trouble. And I think that can feel very cold, right, to the person. So like, it is okay to be a real human and just be like, Mammy, like we've talked about this. You remember we've had 3 conversations about this, right? Like you can still like be that human to human contact and you don't just have to be a robot because some HR person scared you to death about saying the wrong thing.
That makes so much sense. And I actually had a similar situation where someone very early on asked me if they could finish a big project they were working on so that they could put it onto their resume that they had done this work. And it would have been like an extra 2 weeks. Even if they had not done anything else, it would have taken about 2 weeks to wrap up that particular project. And I remember being in the moment kind of like, I don't know what to say to this. Do I say yes? Do I say no? And kind of like going into like robot mode of today is your last day. And now I kind of wish that I would have actually just taken a moment to think about like, what might that have looked like? And to be able to say like, today is officially the last day. I'm open to thinking about what this might look like for you to finish that project, but I'm not committing to it. And like still being a human, right? As you're saying, and talking with someone about like, well, what really does make the most sense, right? That might have actually served the project the best to have them be part of that project to finish it up. It might have served them the best to be able to put it onto their resume, which would help them for their future. It might not have, but I was totally in the like, too scared to say something wrong here. Let's just go back to the talking points and be done.
What you would have like saying like, hey, can I have a beat is not going to get you in trouble. Like, and so I think just like taking a deep breath and like it comes with time, right? I'm sure now you've probably had to have these conversations more that like now you probably would have handled it differently, right? And so it's like if you're new to firing people and you like look back and you're like, ooh, I wish I would have done that different, like you'll get better over time, which is no manager wants to hear what I'm going to have to do this again. But like you will, and you'll start to get more comfortable in the moments of taking a step back and just like responding in a way that, respects the relationship that you've built with that person.
We do have to wrap up though. So Jackie, can you tell us about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss?
One I would like to shout out would be my former CEO who I reported to in my last full-time job, Jessie Janae. She was a founder CEO, kind of first time leading an executive team. And she did the work of figuring out how to be a great leader. She led by example. She was somebody who from the top down led by example, and everybody followed her for that. But the reason why I really think she was a great boss is she would have the most honest conversations with me. And when I was doubting myself or maybe feeling like the team didn't know everything I was working on, she really was the one person who was like, you have to self-advocate for yourself, and just gave me such great feedback. And so she's someone that I really hope that I can be like when I'm leading a team, is just like committing to doing the work and leading from the top.
Love that. And where can people learn more about you and keep up with your work?
Absolutely. So over at my website, peopleprinciples.co, is all of the different services that we have for our HR and recruiting consulting business. But just to learn from me, I actually have a podcast as well, which you're coming on, and I can't wait for our conversation, called World's Greatest Boss. And I do try to be active on LinkedIn as well, as much as I can.
Well, thank you again so much for joining me today. I feel like I have a little more confidence, and hopefully I won't have to fire anyone anytime soon. But when the time comes, which eventually it will, I'm grateful to have learned from you today. So thanks.
Thank you for having me.